HUD, co-author with Laurie Johnson. And Dr. Olshanksy is professor and associate head of urban planning and urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's done a tremendous amount of work in the area of disaster recovery and research on recovery, including on the Northridge earthquake as well as Kobe earthquake. He spent a year, 2 years at the University of Kyoto as a visiting professor, and wrote a book that I encourage everyone to read, Clear as Mud, Planning the Rebuilding of New Orleans, that focuses on the planning processes in New Orleans post-Katrina, which we'll talk a bit about today. And we're just hearing about his upcoming project doing a fairly similar qualitative research study on the Wenchuan earthquake in China. So I'm going to actually turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Doug. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to first sort of give a few introductory comments before we move into the slides. I think it's important to, start with saying that this is about New Orleans, but it's not about New Orleans. It's a case study. It's a big case study of how to actually do recovery after catastrophic disasters. It's part of a longer term work by myself and my colleagues to try and understand how we do this in different places under different circumstances. I also think this endeavor in and of itself has a broader purpose. When we speak about the increasing rate of global change, of environmental change, climate change, and all of those related things. And and the new way of at least talking about these things has to do with qualities of systems to be resilient to that change. And I've always found this to just be a little bit too abstract, talking about resilience of systems and what does that really mean? And change, I think, really happens episodically by events such as Katrina. And we talk about climate change, if we talk about sea level rise, those things aren't going to happen an inch at a time. They're going to happen by means of these large pulses of these dramatic events. And and so post-disaster recovery processes, that's where resilience happens, or not. If we talk about the ability of a system to survive great shocks, great perturbations, where that survival or not survival takes place is in those processes after the event. So it's where you do resilience. And so I find it, I think for me it's a more useful way to think about those concepts, but also I think this has a lot to contribute to that thinking about global change and about resilience. And so, so that's why I do this. I'm not a very good academic. I'm a pretty practical kind of guy, and this is real world stuff, and that's really my interest, is how you actually do it. I want to know what a mayor or a city manager or a governor should actually do in the weeks and months after such an event occurs. And ultimately I want to figure out how to give, in the future, guidance to others when they're faced with some of these kinds of things. So anyway, so this, this is a big case study. We had done this work in largely in Kobe and other places, and it's always filtered in various ways by language, by culture, or by time. You're sort of looking back in time, and there's biases when you look back at these things in time, because especially these kind of crisis situations, when you're in the middle of it, you're really totally uncertain, you lack information, it's a very unique kind of situation to be in. And afterwards, even when you interview the people who are in that situation, they remember it looks differently when you look back on it in time. It always looks better, or they seem like they were more decisive or whatever. And I kind of appreciated we had those biases. So after Hurricane Katrina, it quickly became evident that this was it. This was my chance. This was my case. This was a place where we could go and we could try and get as close to the action, understanding, looking at the decision making as it happened, try to get as close as possible to the decision makers in real time as was going along. And so I just, it was like 3 days after Katrina, I realized that I was just going to, which was conveniently just after I'd spent my year sabbatical in Kyoto University, and was coming back sort of refreshed and trying to decide how I was going to spend my time for the next couple of years, and it was decided for me. So I just committed to just going down there and just started going down there. Every 2 months I went down for a week. I just started making contacts, and that's what happened. And I think to do this sort of thing, you have to do this really very deep, very thorough case study. It's complicated. I'm not naming any names, but I've just seen a lot of things written by people who go there for a week or whatever. They have some preconceived ideas. They go down, they look, validate those ideas. They write some papers where they pontificate on what they think is going on there. And I think it takes a lot more than that to really understand this. Unfortunately, it's a really drag for being a researcher trying to do that, because you have one case and you spend 5 years working on it and don't have any time to work on anything else, and then eventually after a lifetime you have enough data points to make sense of it all. But I think that's the only way to do it. So I guess I'll step out of the way here. I'll get over here. It looks like we've got space. And there we go. I just point this in that direction, I guess. So I think I mentioned this. So imagine a huge disaster strikes your city. This is pictures from China and Port-au-Prince, actually. And so, so what happens? So imagine you're the planning director, city manager, mayor, or maybe the governor of the province. Day 5, maybe we're really talking about more like day 10 or 15. But the idea is we're talking about, after the initial evacuation, temporary shelter, which is an enormous thing to do. Debris removal and so on. But I'm putting that behind. I'm not focused on the immediate response. There is this issue of permanent recovery, and so you have to rebuild. And how do you do it? How do you go about organizing to completely rebuild your entire city? And so this is the research question that drives me: is how can local governments effectively manage post-disaster recovery and reconstruction, meeting the time-sensitive needs of housing and economic recovery, while also maximizing the opportunities for community betterment, as well as resilience from future disasters. So, it's the time-sensitive stuff. There's housing, economic recovery, and you're always thinking about maximizing those opportunities moving to the future. So, just to go through this quickly. So, Katrina flooded 80% of New Orleans. It was mostly this is the map from 1871, I think, and they kind of knew they knew the right places to build then. But in any event, so it flooded all those parts of New Orleans. I think you know a lot about this. 90% of the city's population evacuated all over the country. We don't need to go through these numbers, but it was big. Graphically, this is where we can see at least how it compares to Camille and Andrew by any measure: casualties, damage, number of homes, number displaced, etc. Only Andrew in number evacuated comes close, but by every measure, Katrina was big, which I think we know. So this is some of the studies that we've done before and since. Loma Prieta, Northridge, Kobe. Laurie Johnson actually worked in the Grand Forks, North Dakota flood recovery, and so on. So so the question is, so we looked at all of these other things. So what did we seek to specifically learn from New Orleans? Well, and I think I said this at the beginning. The purpose was for us to understand the key decisions in real time, and also in the context of state and national policies, as well as local politics. The goal was to follow this what I call the nexus of Reconstruction decision making as it occurred, and through this we became embedded observers. And then, to be observer, the way that you get entree is by trading information, by providing useful information, useful advice, and that makes people willing to talk to you. And in that process, we became, in some places, informal advisors, and for a while I had a very official job as advisor, and actually Laurie ended up being one of the chief leaders of the Unified New Orleans Plan. So you start as researchers, as observers, and you end up being participants of the New Orleans planning process. And approximately 3 years where we did this very intensively. So I counted over those 3 years. I visited 19 times, which is about 1 week out of every 2 months. We conducted interviews. You know, they weren't all interviews. Some of them were, you know, dialogues. Some of them were dinner meetings. Some of them were meetings. You know, however you want to call them. But over 70 officials and planners attended lots of public meetings. I was a meeting junkie. I understand that in the evenings in New Orleans you can go see really interesting music. I never went to any of that. Meetings for my entertainment. I mentioned Laurie became a key consultant for the Unified New Orleans Plan. She lived there for 5 months. I became an advisor to that. And the book is based on notes from interviews, conversations, observations, emails, planning documents, news accounts, all that stuff, and bonus, 150 hours of DVD from a filmmaker, Luisa Dantas. She made a film called Land of Opportunity, which is really good. She's still trying to find a U.S. distributor. But anyway, we got a bunch of DVD from her, which was really an experience. I relived a lot of this when I was writing the book. I went back and I could watch these meetings, and which is another experience. It teaches you that what you think you remembered about the time actually is not quite so. The DVDs had things that I didn't, but not how I remember how things happened. So I'm going to give, this is the very quick, simplified version of post-Katrina planning in New Orleans. You know, it's really confusing. One of the purposes of the book is to show how complicated it all is. That's why we wrote the book. It doesn't really lend itself to a brief presentation. So I'm going to go through it fast. You'll see how complicated it is in the various pieces, and I want to get to the lessons and conclusions. So here it goes. So there were these 4 planning efforts. The mayor's effort, led effort to Bring New Orleans Back Commission, which was sort of late 2005. City Council, so-called Lambert plans, from Paul Lambert, the consultant who did them, was in the middle of 2006. The Louisiana Recovery Authority was really the prime mover behind getting the Unified New Orleans plan going, which was from really late 2006. And then implementation was done by the Office of Recovery Management. I have an open hyphen at the end there, but actually that morphed into a different name, and it's morphed into something else now. But this was sort of back into city government, where the previous ones weren't quite so clear. So we all know, you know, the rational planning, right? It should do damage assessment and prepare the plan, citizen input, funding, implementation, rebuilding. This is what a more realistic. I got this out of somebody, a resident of New Orleans, a blog, and I need to cite where it came from. But I thought he captured it really well. This is sort of what it looked like from the resident's point of view, all these different planners and initials and all kinds of things going on. The Louisiana Recovery Authority, I mentioned, this was created by the governor about a month or so after Katrina to secure funding and other resources and to lead long-term community and regional planning efforts. It's a policy-making body at the state level. The Bring New Orleans Back Commission, so the mayor appointed this commission also in October 2005. One of the committees, the Urban Planning Committee, created this, what's known as the Bring New Orleans Back plan. Anyway, and without going into too much details, the result of it when it was unveiled was that many people feared that the government was going to take their land for redevelopment. And there's a whole lot of stories behind why they felt that and what was actually in the plan, and it's all in the book. But that was the reason. That was the public result of it, and as a result, the mayor backed away from supporting that plan. So the mayor set this up. So here we are in March 2006, and 6 months after it's a little more than 6 months after the event, we still have nothing. So the city council initiated their own neighborhood-based planning process by revising the contract of an existing CDBG contractor, Lambert. They somehow, I'm still not sure how, found $3.6 million in available funds. There's, anyway, Paul Lambert gave me a little story about that, but anyway, they did that. And at the same time, a lot of neighborhoods, such as Broadmoor, that you guys were involved in here, a lot of neighborhoods began their own planning in various different ways. So things were starting to happen from the bottom up, which is great. So then the LRA wanted to have sort of a more complete plan for the whole city. They wanted it to be neighborhood-based, but wanted it to be citywide. It was going to cost money they didn't have. So the Rockefeller Foundation agreed to fund half of it. It would be managed by the Greater New Orleans Foundation. This is a very complicated structure for doing this. By June of 2006, they issued a nationwide request for qualifications for a citywide team and for a bunch of neighborhood planning teams. And then they moved pretty quickly from this point, selected the consultants in July, and by August, the mayor, the council, and the LRA signed an MOU to do what was then called the Unified New Orleans Plan. So everybody was harmony, everybody was on board. You'll have to read the book to see that what's really behind this simple statement, and actually they really weren't. They were kind of, sort of closed their eyes and signed it, and then days later pretended they didn't sign it, and then a lot happened there. But on paper, it was a unified New Orleans plan moving forward from then. So this is how it's unified, all these different pieces. The Bring New Orleans Back, Lambert plans, all those independent neighborhood plans, the FEMA process that had gone on as well, and this is the state process. The idea is it goes through all of that, creates a unified plan, get the money, and build it. And another way of looking at it here, the neighborhoods feed into these planning districts, funnels up to the citywide planning team, and on up. All in about 3.5 months, right? And so this is how they set to do it in 3.5 months. So you've got the district meetings kind of shuffled in, these citywide meetings, these so-called community congresses, and it was kind of all top-down and bottom-up all at the same time with delivery on January 13th, which they pretty well met that, which was really insane. I mean, you can't really do planning in this amount of time, but that's, you do what you got to do. So I learned more about planning in this than I had in previous 30 years of being in planning. This is the example, Community Congress 2, which actually was a pivotal point. This was held on December 2nd of 2006. They had 2,500 participants linked by satellite between New Orleans, Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, and Baton Rouge, with additional web links. This was done through the magic of America Speaks. And they managed to go out and recruit, and it represented the demographics of pre-Katrina New Orleans, which was absolutely critical. So it gave credibility to whatever results here. People were randomly mixed at tables, so there was people from all different parts of the city and different socioeconomic groups, and they were really working well together. And had they not been able to do that, this would have had no credibility, and the whole thing would have gone away. So this was really a key moment, and it cost a lot of money for America Speaks to put this together. But had they not done so, I think the whole thing would have gone up in flames. Anyway, so draft was released January 20th, 2007. The citywide, all the district plans. I won't go through this, but they, an estimate of $14 billion of rebuilding need in various programs, phased in over time. Actually, this was the last time we did detailed accounting of the federal funds. 116 billion committed to the Gulf Coast. Some of it goes to Louisiana. Some of that goes to Orleans Parish. Some of it actually goes to the city of New Orleans, managed by them. And at the time, there was 1.1 billion. The city was actually managing more than that now, but not the 14 billion. So implementation began in January 2007. I mentioned the Mayor's Office of Recovery Management was actually established late in the course of UNOP. So this was Ed Blakely's office. He came on board at the beginning of January. The main implementation plan, this target area plan, was announced in March, and this is what it looks like. And basically, it was just a way to focus that $1 billion worth of funds that they were going to be getting from the federal government, that they would be prioritized in these target areas. And this largely came out of a lot of the things that were expressed in UNOP, with a little bit of politics mixed in every council district concept. UNOP was finally approved in May 2007. It was actually handed off to the Office of Recovery Management in January. The Office of Recovery Management was working with it as if it existed all those months, but it wasn't officially approved by the Planning Commission until May. City Council finally accepted by LRA in June of 2007, which would finally release the federal funds, which were less than they were supposed to be, and that's another long story, but it's all in the book. And this is almost 2 years after Hurricane Katrina, so that's kind of what happens here. Implementation is still going on. I think some people might have been there more recently. They're still using the community CDBG funds. Construction is actively, took a while for that stuff to come through, but it's being built now. FEMA public assistance funds, roads and other public facilities, that's being done actively now. FEMA mitigation funds are available for people who want to elevate their houses, and that's happening. The road home funds, which was really kind of a huge amount of federal money, which is a whole other story. Actually, we had another study on this, and there's a working paper, Lincoln Institute working paper that we did that you can get online about that. But anyway, that's still going on. People are still figuring out how to finance rebuilding their houses. And some people, despite all of that, they still have gaps. They don't have the resources to meet the need for, given the construction costs. And so foundations and other CDBG funds, they're still working on providing gap financing for home reconstruction for people who can afford. So this is all still current. It's all still happening. It's going to be another 2 to 5 years before we could, say that this is a past tense thing that we want to go back and look at. So that's the quick story. Let's see, I think we're doing okay here. So new insights gained from New Orleans. So just a couple of slides here on major characteristics of recovery. One of the key aspects of recovery is what I call the tension between speed and deliberation, which is you absolutely need to rebuild as quickly as possible because you've got economic networks, you have social networks, and they still exist even when the buildings are gone, but they don't exist. They won't exist very well for very long. So you've got to get things rebuilt so things can get operating again. A lot of people, small businesses in particular, they really can't survive without things getting back operating. So you got to do speed, but you also have to do it well. This is your one chance. You're rebuilding everything now, and it's going to last for 30, 50, 100 years. And so you don't want to screw it up too badly, and you want to take advantage of the opportunity. So some deliberation is good too. And so it's true that you need to both rebuild as quickly as possible, and you also need to slow down and think about what you're doing. And somehow, it's sort of and I'll talk about this a little later, the crux of coming up with processes and institutions for doing this is how to in fact go as fast as possible and to think as much as possible all at the same time. Need for large sums of money, this is really kind of the key thing that defines what you have to do after recovery, because the city's gone, it costs a lot to build, it's going to cost a lot to rebuild, and how to find all that money quickly really drives everything. So it's a fast-paced, dynamic environment. One constant is change. It occurs quickly and often, and this is just, I'm saying this, but those of you who have been involved in these things know that this is very literally true. The one constant is change, and everything is in motion. New organizations emerge. Inequitable access to power is usually exacerbated under these circumstances. Successful recovery, the first goals are obviously to restore infrastructure and essential services, returning to the previous level of economic function and regaining households' livelihoods, and third, to replace at least the quantity of lost housing units. Now you want to do better than this, but at least if you can get households' livelihoods going and you can get a roof over everybody's head, that's kind of the bare minimum of successful recovery. And again, success is measured by both speed and quality, which often conflict. Who's in charge of recovery? Well, nobody. Who's in charge of building the city in the first place? It's done by many people, many actors. More than one organization is involved in building cities. Government is just one of the actors. It's an important one, but it's only one. And information is a really vital commodity. It's scarce, really scarce, in post-disaster circumstances. But it's an important way to help to coordinate all these actors. To the extent that each of these actors know what each other is doing, and there's information out there, and they understand the environment, recovery can proceed more effectively. They can coordinate, they can collaborate. And so that's really a key piece. So the overarching lessons from New Orleans, first I'd say it confirmed these general principles we just talked about and elaborated, I think, a lot in them. It brought home the complex reality of many actors seeking resources, starved for information, and constrained by time. And I'm going to say that again, because this is kind of the system that I think is operating. So it's many actors, they're seeking resources, they're starved for information, and constrained by time. And that's kind of the unique soup that is post-disaster recovery. And so, and this dynamic of actors, resources, information, and time constraint has implications for institutional design, which I'll get to later. I'd say one other thing in this case is there were some especially problematic manifestations of the tension between reconstruction and betterment. It came from a lot of the sort of unique aspects of New Orleans. So the best way, I think, to look at some of the lessons is through what I'll call the New Orleans FAQs, because these are the most frequently asked questions. So the first one is why were there so many plans, and which one is the right plan? Second is, are government plans needed at all? Shouldn't rebuilding just occur from the bottom up? Isn't this just urban politics as usual in New Orleans? So maybe, all this was really complicated, but that's just because it's New Orleans. This wouldn't happen anywhere else like this, would be that question. Why couldn't New Orleans be built back much safer? And finally, an important question for us as planners is, did any of these plans actually accomplish anything? So we'll hit these one at a time. So why were there so many plans? Which one is the right one? It has to thinking about this imperative for funding. The most urgent need being money. Much of it comes from outside sources, and so if you think about all these different actors, they all need money. And actors are the city, the sewer and water board, business owners, individual homeowners, neighborhood groups, all these different actors. They all need money, and they need a plan to use it well. And in plan here, we use, it's a more, generic kind of term. We all have a plan. If your house burns down and you get insurance to rebuild, you have a plan for how you're going to use that money and how you're going to rebuild the house. So each of these entities needs money. They need a plan to use it well, and they will use these plans to help them to obtain the money. Whoever's going to give them the money wants to know that that they know what they're doing. So use the plan to help convince others to give them the money, and then to be able to intelligently apply those funds to attain recovery goals. And these plans are also used to inform and influence others. So again, if you think of a neighborhood, individuals deciding what they're going to do, whether they're going to come back, how they're going to rebuild, they communicate that to their neighbors, their neighborhood group communicates to other neighborhood groups, and that being informed about what everybody else is doing helps you to decide how you're going to act within that environment. And part of that environment is knowing what the city's plans are, or what they're going to do. And so, really, it was more than just these 4 plans we talked about. There were all these other plans, formal and informal, going on. And really, they were a collective dance for money to document needs and to in some cases, justifying funds all reallocated. And so it's part of a conversation. And they also, I think, were a very important public discussion about reconstruction funding and the process of reconstruction. So, so to answer that, obviously none was the right plan, and you're always going to have a lot of plans because you have a lot of actors with different purposes, and that's the way it should be. So, are government plans needed at all? Shouldn't rebuilding just occur from the bottom up? Well, to sort of reinforce that, we know there are major limitations on the role of government after disasters. The post-disaster environment demands more than bureaucracies can provide. Bureaucracies just don't operate at the kind of speeds. They lack flexibility, they can't innovate, they're not designed to act quickly. Being nimble, and thinking on their feet is not the term that we usually attribute to government bureaucracies. And that's what's needed after disasters. And so as a result, new non-governmental and community-based organizations always emerge, this always happens after big disasters, to fill the gaps. And sometimes people say, see, government, they're worthless, so we have to take it into our own hands, and here's the evidence of it, all these groups emerge. Well, that's always going to happen. And in fact, that's a good thing, because we actually know that government isn't going to be able to do everything, and all of those groups had better emerge, because that's really what's needed to do the job. And those organizations are really the keys to successful recovery. But that said, so what's the role of government? Well, government's important. They're an important actor in this. They alone rebuild public infrastructure, public facilities, public services. They set public budget priorities, and by their actions, they can influence private investors. Government is also a very significant source of money. You know, in this case, the federal government is a source of money. You know, most other disasters we look at, there's either a national government or international aid agencies funneled through national government. So they have the capability to provide money, to provide information, and to provide technical assistance to help all these actors operate. And so really a role of government to support all these actors in doing what they're good at, and also an important role of government is to try to not get in their way. Lately I've been just sort of talking about this as imagine like an ecosystem of builders. And they need resources, they need nutrients, and those nutrients are primarily money and information. And government is the organization that I think is uniquely well equipped to be able to provide that money and information to feed that ecosystem. And also, government can provide critical leadership in order to accomplish all of these things. This is a problem in New Orleans. There was a void of local leadership. Because of that, misinformation flourished. And into that vacuum of political free-for-all developed. So this is kind of a good case of what happens if you're not doing those things, right? And so there were several competing, not only, there was all those plans, but you ended up having these competing government plans, one by the mayor, one by the city council, one being sponsored by the state, that's not an ideal situation. Also, there was no central point of information, which is what I think, in my opinion, was what the role of City Hall should have been. A lot of people said, Mayor Nagin, he didn't provide enough leadership, and by that they meant that he was, should have taken a firm hand and said, rebuild here, don't rebuild there. And I don't think that was really his position to be able to do that. I don't think it would have accomplished anything. But I thought that City Hall really did, in fact, was the obvious place to be a central place for information. At least hold a press conference every day, something. And it was not at all. Okay, so yes, there's an important role for government plans, along with a lot of other plans. So isn't this just urban politics as usual in New Orleans? And no, there was a lot of things unique in New Orleans, but kind of the chief characteristic of recovery, we believe is time compression, which is this: that normal city building processes, and they're very complex. We know how complex these things are. And you take it all and you compress it in a very short time period. But some things speed up better than others. One thing that doesn't speed up very well is planning, public involvement, information flows. And a plan simply can't be compressed into 4 months by hiring more planners. So they have like hundreds of planners working on UNOP in 3.5 to 4 months, for $10 million. Well, I think for the same $10 million and maybe 50 planners over 4 years, you would have, I think, a better plan in that you could really engage people, you could create more information. So some things speed up differently than others, and this is a whole other topic I'm not going to go into here, but we've been kind of teasing through this theory, and we think that all the features characteristics that we attribute to the recovery environment are all in varying ways symptoms of this one central thing, which is time compression. If you think about all the different lenses through which we study urban construction processes from the point of view of planning or public administration, political science, sociology, whatever, and everybody has their theoretical lenses for looking at those. There's no overall theory of recovery, just like there's no overall theory of how cities are built in the first place. But the theory of recovery is really this meta theory that you're time compressing everything. So if you think of all those other different theoretical lenses, the way people look at how cities are built, if you can look at each one of those and think about the ways in which time compression will affect it and differentially affect different parts of it, creating in effect sort of a new different universe that has different characteristics. That's the environment in a post-disaster city. So it is it's a different world. It's a different dimension. It's a different whatever metaphor you could think of. After a big disaster, things work the same. You get the same pieces, but they operate differently in different ways because of time compression. And so this has happened in New Orleans. It's going to happen. It'll happen in San Francisco. It'll happen, here when you get a storm bigger than the one we had this week. So, and you know, there's this fog of war thing. You know, actions flow much faster than information, and this went on for many months in New Orleans. You know, nobody, individuals, you know, homeowners, agencies, the mayor's office, nobody had enough information to make decisions. And you know, I think it's important to understand this. I mean, it's really like that. You know, saying when you talk about, you know, when you read things about these disaster situations, you say, well, you know, it was chaos, or there was not enough information, or it seemed really nutty. Well, I mean, it seemed really nutty. I mean, people who were supposed to know stuff didn't know. People who were going into work one day, who were, you know, in charge of some significant part of the recovery, had no clue what they were supposed to do that day or what others expected of them. And that's the way it is. You know, I talk about how planning needs time for, you know, participants to, you know, get information, to comprehend it, building trust, looking at alternatives, feeling confident in the decision, and, you know, none of this stuff can happen. So there's this, you know, anyway, fog of war characteristic, which, you know, we know this is what happens in post-disaster response. But to me, it was enlightening to see that this continues in a big disaster, it continues for a long time into the recovery period, which makes it difficult. And one of the insights that I really got in doing this book, and I didn't really appreciate it until I was actually writing the book, as opposed to when I was in the middle of it, was this planning for the wrong battle. And what it is that people involved, they were developing strategies based on, it was rooted in various points in time. So, and it's logical. So you have organization, you meet in this conference room, you come with some kind of a strategy based on what's going on, you know, in you know, what month is now? Yeah, January, you know, in November. And then you start working on it. And then you come back to the meeting in January based on what you worked on. There's another group, you know, that started doing that back in August. There's another group that started doing that last month. And you all come to this meeting together, and because remember, the one constant is change. Things are changing all the time. So, you know, so you're here and you're rooted in what happened last month, and you're here and you're rooted in what happened, you know, 3 months ago, and you're here and you're representing the group rooted in some other point in time. And so why were these meetings so nutty, where, you know, nobody could quite understand what was going on? Is because everybody is talking some different language based on some different set of assumptions, which were all valid at the time that they started, but none of them, even the one a month ago, none of them actually make any sense for what's going on today. And I found some examples of that I talked through in the book, and to me it kind of suddenly opened up, you know, oh, that's why that particular meeting seemed so weird. And that's why, and so I think, you know, I think this is a really important characteristic of post-disaster recovery, why observers were so confused, and it's not just New Orleans, it's going to happen anywhere else. So that answers that one. So this was, I mean, there was a lot of urban policies as usual in New Orleans, but these big nasty things that were going on would happen, I think, any place under these circumstances. So why couldn't the city be built back much safer? Well, you know, I think we all know that post-disaster reconstruction is always an opportunity to right the wrongs of the past, to build a better city in many different ways. You know, hazard mitigation being one of them, but there's a whole lot of things. But in New Orleans, the greatest wrongs, you know, one of them was flood-prone construction, but also there was racial discrimination and poor governance. And, you know, none of these has been really very easy to fix. And, you know, and again, the tension between restoration and change, and in New Orleans, this tension was particularly severe. Because there were a lot of people, outsiders, you know, who they came in with great ideas to restructure the urban form. We should, you know, let's not build in the low-lying areas, let's build new transit systems, you know, all of these great ideas. And residents really rebelled against, you know, any of these ideas. They wanted the place that they had before, it was their home. And this whole debate was hugely colored by racial mistrust, because a lot of those lowest lying areas corresponded to the areas that had the highest proportion of African American population, low income population. Not in all cases, but there was a significant correlation between those. And so all of this made things really difficult. And so to talk about this building back safer was really part of a much more complex dynamic. It wasn't just a matter of deciding to elevate houses or to relocate them. You know, that said, actually the city is incrementally safer than it was before. There are fewer homes in the lowest lying areas. A lot of the homes in the lowest lying areas have been elevated, and there have been improvements. The Corps of Engineers have made some improvements in the levee system around the city. None of these things are perfect, but I would say, and I can't attach a percent to it, but the city is, in fact, incrementally safer in several ways than it was before. So, did any of the plans accomplish anything? Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. As a planner, I believe in the value of, of information, empowerment, public discussion, all of those things. I think they all help to generate information. They all provided important public discussion in the future. New Orleans was not a place that really had a planning culture before. I think people feel more empowered than they did before. I think UNOP was reasonably transparent. It had broad participation. It carried a lot of credibility, more so than the other plans. And I think it's important to think about that as an important planning milestone. It wasn't an end point. Some people, citizens have various conceptions of planning. Some of them thought that we'll do this plan, we'll draw the plan, it'll be kind of like SimCity, right? And then, it'll all get built. And a lot of them were disillusioned and angry afterwards that, they were had. But, it just was a step along the way. It was a milestone. It created a lot of the neighborhood associations that were really empowered through this. It helped to create a citywide discussion of planning. It was always intended to be a first step towards a new master plan, which they've just done. They're working on a new zoning ordinance. They're still working on kind of reinventing the way planning goes through City Hall. They're working on the citizen participation program, and they're developing an office of, I forget what it's called, but like an office of neighborhood services. And so all this stuff is going on now, and these were important steps to take to get to where we are now, and right now is important steps to take to keep moving towards the future. So I think it helped to do all that. Also, it helped to improve the city's image, and maybe it's not quite right to say it helped to improve the city's image, but if we didn't have these plans, and in particular UNOP, I think it would have not been good for the city's image for them to go through this whole thing and to be able to say that they were not together enough to even figure out how to plan for rebuilding their future. So I think the plans were useful. Some institutional lessons out of all of this, I think you could figure out from some of the things we said, is that you should. I think post-disaster recovery, you want to create institutions or adapt existing ones aimed at money, identifying source of money, allocating money, and then tracking the financing, so transparency, all of that. And the second is information, collecting, maintaining, and distributing information. So, again, those are the two currencies of post-disaster recovery, money and information. And so you want to design institutions that can manage those. You want organizations that can provide information to various actors systematically and to coordinate with them regularly. Again, this idea of providing these resources to feed this ecosystem of builders. And I think you always have to remember creativity and improvisation is what happens under these circumstances. And you don't want to enable. You want to enable, unleash creative power, however you want to say it, without tying people's hands unnecessarily with too many restrictions, because you really need room to improvise if the one constant is change. And it's best to have plans and planning in place beforehand. To me, this is one of the, as a planning academic, this is one of the best cases of why you need to have planning, is because you have a crisis, and it could be a mortgage foreclosure crisis, it could be a hurricane, it could be a big snowstorm, and this isn't going to solve everything, but to the extent that you have at least these things in place ahead of time. So if they had in New Orleans, if they had this sort of organization of neighborhood organizations in place ahead of time, that would have been a means by which people could have kept in touch while they were scattered all over the country, because they would have already had these mechanisms, and they could have hit the ground running a lot better if they had, plan in place beforehand. At least that would have been a starting point for them instead of having to start from scratch. They did actually a remarkably good job starting from scratch, but if you got these things in place ahead of time, I think it makes things go a lot better. And I think this is my last slide. So, I think we've been able to develop this complex story of the planning post-Katrina New Orleans. As I mentioned, not as simple as other interpretations. And so, for me, the big reason for doing the book was to do the history and all its as much of its complexity as possible. Again, kind of focused at the governmental level. And it also provides, I think, a richer lens through which to view all these other things. Kobe, we understand Kobe in new ways that we didn't before. We've thought of new questions to ask our colleagues in Kobe after having gone through this experience. And it's helped me to understand these other places, Aceh, Sichuan, and so on, as well as, I think, helping us to think in clearer ways about what would happen in some of these future U.S. disasters. I talked a little bit about that. And any questions you want to ask? And finally, there it is, the book. And I've got, I have 4 copies right here. You can buy them from APA. You can buy them from Amazon for $40 cash, no delivery charge, no tax. You can buy one of these copies from me. So that's it.